This is a lecture from OpenTuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com.
This chapter looks at data information and at some graphical ways in which information can be usefully presented. First of all, the difference between data and information. You can regard data as essentially being the raw facts, the raw statistics, for example. So if you were looking at the heights of everyone in the city, this could simply be a great big list, several 100,000 people with all our heights. But I think you'll understand that that's not actually very useful, because there's so much data really that we can't draw very many conclusions, say maybe about average heights, or the heights of men versus women, or the heights of 6-year-olds to 7-year-olds, 7-year-olds to 8-year-olds, and so on, or maybe different heights in different areas of the city, dependent perhaps on how affluent they were, how rich they were. So to make something really useful, you have to add some sort of meaning to it, and then it becomes information. It's informative. So information is data with meaning. And the sorts of ways in which you can give a meaning to it would be maybe something like averages. Another way in which you might be able to give meaning to it is where you have exceptions. For example, when you are looking at who owes you money, and you could have a great big list of invoices which are still outstanding, it's actually going to be quite useful if you would have a little specialist printout of all invoices maybe more than 90 days old, because they're the ones you're really going to be particularly worried about. It can also be made more informative by looking at graphs, because we'll see that the shape of the graphs, whether it's a line or a bar, can more immediately communicate to you how the data is actually moving. Now the components or the qualities of good information can be remembered by this mnemonic here, where we have accurate going down. Sometimes you'll read maybe some books where some of these initials stand for something slightly different, but most of them are pretty uniform. So the first thing we need to have good information is that it must be accurate. But accurate is slightly elastic. If you were the chief executive officer of a multi-million-pound dollar oil company, then you don't need information down to the last dollar or the last cent. It's getting more accurate as you go down, but it's actually not going to be very useful. Indeed, it could be distracting to have all of these huge long figures. It may be sufficiently accurate for you to have it to the nearest $1 million in some very large companies. So accurate, it depends on what you're using it for. People who are dealing with the day-to-day transactions really need it down to the last cent, because they will be dealing with invoices, they'll be looking at payments, making sure they match. As you go up the hierarchy and as you get more towards the board, then the accuracy doesn't have to be quite so precise. You can begin rounding figures and you'll begin to probably appreciate rather better what's happening. Information has to be complete. It can sometimes be very difficult to know when it is complete or when something has been left out. But, for example, it is important in some printouts to say things like this is page 1 of 6, 2 of 6, 3 of 6, all the way up to 6 of 6. So if the final couple of pages of the printout have been torn out and lost or something, you know that the report is incomplete and liable, therefore, to lead you into making wrong decisions. cost beneficial. In any profit-seeking organization, we have to make sure that we keep our eye on maximizing profits, and there is no point in having information which maybe costs us $10,000 to obtain if it's only ever going to save us $1,000. We're not after information for information's sake. In a non-profit-seeking organization, you still need to get good value for money. There is no point, let's say, in a hospital spending $30,000 if it's only going to get maybe one more patient seen in the year. It's fairly obviously going to be difficult to see how the benefit outweighs or matches the cost. It has to be understandable or user targeted. You want the information that you're going to be receiving. You want it to be made for you, so to speak, something you can deal with, something which is within your area of responsibility, and you want it properly labelled. If you get lots and lots of information which is not particularly user targeted, then you get something called information overload. You simply don't see the wood for the trees. You simply have got so much information you can't see what the important areas are. Rather similar, it has to be relevant. It has to be relevant to the decisions you're making. It has to be relevant to what you can decide about, and so on. It also has to be relevant to really the objectives of the organization. If the objectives of the organization is to try to maximize profits, then the information should be geared to doing that. So if they are very, very interested in reducing costs, to see that as the way of increasing profits, then you need a lot of information showing about the cost of production and so on, so that it becomes relevant to achieving the goals, or it might be called the mission of the organization. Two quite different words here for the second A in it: adaptable or authoritative. You do want information to be adaptable. Good IT systems nowadays allow you to what's known as drill down. So in other words, you might see total receivables $1 million, but you can double click on that and then it says from subsidiary A the receivables are 400,000, and then we have 300,000 and 300,000 from the other two subsidiaries. You double click on one of those and you can see all the major receivable balances for any particular subsidiary. That is adapting the information. You sometimes just need to see the whole total, but sometimes you might want to drill down to see who the biggest debtors actually are. You have to believe it is authoritative. In other words, you can believe it. And of course, this is something where you have to be particularly wary about the internet. Obviously, some sources you could assume to be fairly authoritative, but there are an awful lot of sources of information on the internet, and really you've no idea who's created them. You often have also no idea how old they are. So even though it might have been right when it was first put up on the web page, after 5 years it could well be out of date. And if they haven't put a last updated piece of information on the web page, then you need to be just a little bit wary about that. It has to be timely. This simply means you have to get the information quickly enough to be able to do something with it, to be able to help your decision making. So in some types of application, information has to come within fractions of a second. In what's called production control, where you're controlling machines, or in modern aeroplanes where they're what's known as fly-by-wire, then the information has to be available very, very quickly. You have to make very quick adjustments to the machinery. If someone phones up and says, do you have a certain part in stock, then you can't really expect them to waiting 15 minutes until you find out. You want to tap on your computer and you want people to tell them, yes, we have that in inventory, maybe within 10 or 20 seconds. Other applications don't need the information as quickly. If you're doing something with monthly salaries, you might be able to wait several weeks before you actually extract the information, because the salaries are not going to be paid for another month. In general, the quicker you get the information, the faster you ask for it, probably the more expensive the system is going to be. Whereas slower, older systems may be perfectly capable of producing information, but with a little bit more of a delay. So the cost-beneficial bit comes in here again. We don't need the fastest possible machines always to produce the fastest possible information, because we may not actually need the information that quickly. And finally, it has to be easy to use. The users have to be able to get quickly to the information they want through some sort of menu system. Ideally, there might be some sort of shortcut type system. So if for example, if you want to print a Word document, you can go to the file and you go down to the print and you print it. Or the shortcut is just Control-P. And you get to know these shortcuts, and it saves an awful lot of time. We begin now looking at various sorts of charts. We'll go through these very quickly, or most of them very quickly, because they're pretty straightforward. Here are what's called a column chart. It just presents the data in columns. So here we have 4 years worth of sales and costs of sales. The sales are the blue, the cost of sales are the red figures. And just look at what we can see here. We can see that by and large the sales are increasing. They went up a little bit in 2011 and then kind of came down again, but then they're up again. If we had to kind of get what's known as a trend, a feeling for how the sales are actually moving, well, we'd probably be thinking, there's a kind of a fairly kind of gentle increase in the sales. However, what else we can see in this pretty easily is you can see that the distance, if you like, or the difference between the sales figures and the cost of sales figures has increased quite nicely. So we can see here this distance in here and this distance in here. This is showing you what your profit is. And we can see that not only are sales absolutely increasing, but it looks as though the profit margin is increasing as well. And this is one of the great joys of putting information into graphs. You can quickly see how the data is moving, and you can draw conclusions from that. It also tends to be much more memorable. So if next year it kind of went down to this sort of height, then goodness me, you're not going to forget that very obvious quick drop-off in the revenue, and you're probably going to get a little bit worried about it. Very similar, but just drawn the other way, you have what's called bar charts here. This is exactly the same data, just turned on its side. I think this is by far the commonest, actually, but this does exist. A line chart, the same information, the same data presented in a line chart. And it's very difficult to decide, really. Would you rather have a column chart or would you rather have a line chart there? The thing about line charts is you can kind of make them continuous, whereas the column charts tend to be rather separate. But again, we maybe get a very good idea of the what we'll call the trend in here, the underlying kind of movement of the sales. And again, we can very easily see that the distance between the sales and the cost of sales shows quite a nice, healthy increase. A scatter graph. A scatter graph is where we basically graph two variables. Both of these here had time really along one of the axes here. We're not doing that anymore in these particular scatter graphs. We are wanting to see what is the relationship between average temperature and the amount of electricity that has been consumed in any particular month. Now, the way the information was presented was simply in time order, January through to December, just in order of the year. And of course, when you're looking at this here, you don't immediately see what the relationship might be, or if there's a very good relationship indeed, between the average temperature and the heating costs, basically. But when you graph these out here, so here we have a temperature of 6, and imagine the temperature of 6 in here is, well, there's 12,000, there's going to be 6. Sorry, this graph doesn't have the scale on it here, it should really have the scale on it. Down there, there's going to be 6. And then the highest temperature we have going down here can be 29, and we're down to just 1,000 there, so this is kind of 29. And you can see there's, by putting these on a graph, that the readings are really very well clustered indeed around a line. And we could conclude from this that there does seem to be really quite a good relationship between the average temperature and the decrease, and because it goes up, then the amount of electricity consumed is going down. And this may enable us then, in the future, we'll talk about this more when we get to looking at correlation and regression here. But one of the things we could kind of work out, well, perhaps if the temperature is here, could we predict what the consumption of electricity is going to be? And one of the things we might simply be able to do is kind of go off the graph like that as a prediction for maybe a future electricity bill. Pie charts are particularly good at showing how a total is made up, the proportions in a total. So here we have 4 sales areas in the world: Europe, Asia, North America, South America. Here we have the sales. You put them into a pie chart like this, where the angle, if you like, of the slice of the pie is related to the sales, related to the variable here. And again, by looking at this, you can very, very quickly see which the most significant area is, which the least significant areas, and so on. And again, just making it a little bit easier for you to extract meaning from the data. Now we're going to look at particular sorts of information known as frequency distributions. And frequency distributions just say, between the ages of 5 and 6 at a school, there are 20 pupils. Between the ages of 6 and 7 at a school, there's maybe 18 pupils. So the frequency of occurrence of items or people with certain characteristics. Now, you can have 2 sorts of data that can be shown on a frequency distribution, or indeed 2 sorts of data in general. You can have discrete or continuous data. So this here, the height, is continuous. There is a continuous, if you like, range of people between, in this population, between 0.8 of a meter and up to 2.2 of a meter. So we can have 0.8, 0.81, or 0.801, or 0.880001, and so on, depending how accurate you want to take the readings. But any specific height is going to be possible, so the data can be continuous. Or we have discrete data. So discrete data can only take specific values, and here we're looking at inhabitants in a block of apartments, really. This is saying, well, there are 14 apartments where there's only 1 person living. There's 22 apartments where there's 2 people living, and so on here, up to only 1 apartment with 6 people living. So obviously the number of people residing there has to be whole numbers. we can't have 2.5 or 5.4 or something of that sort. So it is discrete. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is all you can have. And we have the frequencies. Now really, if you're going to be dealing with continuous data, to get any sort of meaning from it, you have to group it. So here we have grouped it into 0.8 and 1.1. Because if you say how many people are 0.834 meters high, then probably no one is 0.834 meters high. There might be somebody who's 0.837 meters high. And because it's continuous, again, depending on how accurately you take the readings, there's an awful lot of heights where nobody's going to figure that. But basically we want to know, who's in this range of centimeters tall or meters tall, who's in that range of meters tall, and you group the data together. The way this has been grouped here is we have what's called equal intervals. So each of them, the jumps in here, is 0.2 of a meter. So we have equal intervals. It doesn't have to be equal intervals. Quite often at the ends, when maybe you've got very, very few people at the end, rather than having lots and lots of little intervals, you hardly anybody in it, you might say, right, from 2 meters up to 2.5 meters, we'll just lump all of those people together, the very tall people together, and so on. And then maybe from 0.8 down to 0.3 or something, we'll lump all of those people together, because there's not going to be very many of them down there, probably. Now, how can we present this data? And the first method is a histogram. And you can do this with either the grouped data or you can do it with the discrete data. We're just doing it here with continuous data which has been grouped. So here what you put along the bottom are the classes, the different height ranges along here. And basically what we have up the side here is going to be the frequencies. So this is the frequency. Strictly speaking, is a frequency density. But if all the intervals are the same, like here, 0.2 meters, then the height is proportional to the frequency. So we see here the highest one is obviously coming in at about 73, and these are the people who are 1.6 to 1.8 meters tall. Down here we've got a little bit less than 10, which looks like 8 in here. And these are the people who are 2 to 2.2 meters tall. And again, it's giving us quite an interesting picture here. We see that there are relatively few people at the extreme ranges of height, but in the middle here, there's a great cluster of people who you might say are kind of average height or kind of around the middle of the range and so on. And this sort of pattern, a pattern something like this, is very frequently found in all sorts of natural measurements like height or like weight or IQ or maybe your cholesterol or something of that sort. It tends to be very few, very low frequencies at the extremes, and then goes through this what's called a bell-shaped curve. Now, about anything which is tricky with histograms is if you don't have these on even intervals in here. So, for example, if we were to combine these two here, instead of having 1.4 to 1.6 and 1.6 to 1.8, we were to say, look, let's make it an interval twice the size there, 1.4 to 1.8, then we'd have to lump these two together here. So we're going to have 69, 9 and 3 is going to be 2, and then we're going to have 142, I think, in there. Now, it would obviously be a little bit odd looking if in going from 1.4, which is kind of here, up to 1.8, which I think is here, is suddenly this kind of shot up here somewhere. to be really, really tall, up, get it really kind of up to 142. This is giving a very, very kind of wrong impression. And the rule is that if you kind of double the interval here, then you have to change the scale here. You effectively have to halve the scale, the vertical scale there. And if we just see the next graph, which we don't have it here, but what we'll be doing is saying, well, really, this is twice the width. So this here really has to be about 71. We'll be drawing this up somewhere like that. Yeah. So we're getting kind of the same overall shape. Yeah. Because this is twice the size, this has to be kind of half the height. And that's what's called the frequency density. So histograms, this is worked through in the notes, yeah, and you see it accurately drawn in the notes. But if it's equal intervals, then the height is proportional to the volume. Once you begin changing the intervals, then the height has to change a little bit. If I was to subdivide an interval, then I would have to effectively double the height in that to make the graph kind of come out looking similar. The graph shouldn't change radically depending what the interval is. The last type of graph we have here, variously called an ogive or a cumulative frequency curve, and sometimes, and actually quite a useful name for it, is a less than curve. A less than curve. So we have the same data as before, basically. The height ranges and the frequencies. And what we do is you produce cumulative frequencies. So if I put a kind of extra column in here, we put in the cumulative people. So less than 1 meter, there are 10 people, just these 10. Less than 1.2 meters, you have 22, but also you have this 10, so it's going to be 32. Less than 1.4 meters, you have 45 plus 22%, or just 45 plus 32, in fact, in there. It's going to be 77. And so on up. Less than 1.6 meters, you're going to be adding 69 onto that. So that is going to be 1646, I think. Be interesting to see if I end up with the right total down here. And the cumulative one for the next one is going to be 9. It's going to be 219. And then in here we're going to have 1682. And then we're going to have 294. So 286 and 294 as the total number of people who are less than the upper limit of the range, less than curve, less than the upper limit of that particular range. And you can graph it out here. So here we have at 1.2, for example, here, we've got 32. This is going to be your 32. At the upper range here of 1.4, we have 77. And then at 1.6, we have 146. Well, just less than 150 in that. And then we're going to have up here less than 1.8, we have 219, which is going to be there, and so on. And you get this, again, very characteristic curve of many natural processes, a kind of swan neck shape that you're getting here. Very flat here because there aren't many people to be added in that particular range from the 2 to 2.2. There aren't very many people being added in that range. But in the middle, as you go up through these ranges here, really you're beginning to entrap lots more people. Lots more people come into that less than kind of a rule.